Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Jeff Peterson looks at corn and soybean markets. Tina Barrett gives a preliminary look at 2014 farm incomes. Brad Lubben describes ag property tax reform concepts. And Jenny Rees recaps results from on-farm research using cover crops. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners is our market analyst this week. As Market Journal producer Curtis Harms and I are currently traveling out of the country, filling in for me is former Market Journal host Doug Jose. Doug and Jeff looked at corn and soybean markets Thursday afternoon.
Jeff, it's still April, but we are into full swing of planting season. How is it developing?
You know what, it's really interesting, Doug. It's always fun this time of year to see the tractors out in the field. And you know, it really depends upon where you're at in the nation. You know, the last report that came out last Monday had us actually 9% complete on corn. That's a little bit behind the average. Five-year average is about 13. However, it is ahead of last year in which we were at 6%. But it depends on where you are, how things are going. Eastern Corn Belt, it's slow. Ohio River Valley, Ohio, Indiana, northern part of the Delta, the Boot Hill, Missouri, you know, they've been waterlogged and they need some time to dry out and before they can get going. And there's a little bit of concern in the market. It stuck its head up just a little bit today about, you know, are we going to get all the corn acres planted that we think? But then you go to the northwest part of the Corn Belt and it's dry. North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, you know, they're just waiting for the temperatures to warm up a little bit and they'll be in full swing. Coming back here into Nebraska, if we get past this rain event that we have scheduled for this weekend and get the temperatures to warm up, you know, we're going to be planning in some pretty nice conditions. So
there's a bit of uncertainty in the market as to how that might progress.
Oh, there is. And what's also rather unique about this is the fund position. A lot of years when we come in, you know, the funds are kind of sitting right in the middle of ground. They don't really want to stick their toe in, you know, to the bullish side or the bearish side. But this year they placed some pretty big bets. As a matter of fact, on the soybean side, they're short about 70,000 contracts of beans. That's a pretty big short. It's nearing a record. On the corn, prior to today's trade, they were short about 47,000 contracts. So they're actually kind of leaning on this market a little bit, which could make it interesting with some uncertainty that we have here in the weather.
So they looked at those planting intentions and really took them to heart then, so to speak.
Yes, they did. They definitely did. And long term, they're probably going to be right. In the short term, you know what? Mother Nature's here and it'll kind of rule for a while.
Another thing that's probably affecting our market, Jeff, is the dollar and the value of the dollar. I did some checking compared to in Brazil, and the U.S. dollar compared to the real is about 40% up since last year. Is that having an impact on our markets?
You know what it is. It's always, you know, we rely so heavily on the exports and the beans, and they're a very important part. And Brazil and Argentina, as a result of that, you know, they're being very, very competitive. The other thing we have going on a little bit here in the U.S., and the farmers changed his selling patterns a little bit. And what that's caused us to do is we got a little bit stronger basis than what we normally have. So we've got our prices a little bit higher than what we'd like to see. And then we counter that with South American being a little cheaper. We're still getting some exports, but they definitely are starting to switch and go south.
In the trucker strike situation, what's happening there?
You know what, it's been kind of an on again, off again thing all kind of, you know, in through the winter and into the early spring. The trucker strikes fired up a little bit. There's only about 13 incidents today, in the region, the different provinces. Most of it's centered in Mato Grosso. The police were able to get those cleared out pretty quick. We don't think it's going to have a real big impact on the market, not anything like what the earlier ones did.
What about the bird flu here? Is that going to decrease our demand on our feed grains?
And that's what's interesting right now is everybody's sitting there and looking at that and wondering, is that going to turn into another PED like we had in the hog side? And we don't think so. Our information would indicate to us that it's really setting up a lot like what the migratory path has been on the birds. We saw some earlier in the southern states. Minnesota had been kind of the latest area in which a lot of those reports had shown up. Up in Minnesota, though, most of that's happening in turkeys. So, so far it's stayed away really from our broilers.
So the bottom line, Jeff, as far putting all these factors together, what do you recommend in terms of the 15 crop?
Yeah, right now in the 15 crop, what I'd really recommend is get your finger on the trigger. And if we go ahead and see a little bit of a bounce in your markets, which we really could see because of the weather that we have, there's enough uncertainty that could happen. I'd be getting some sales on the books. We're pretty heavily sold, and it's really just because we want to make sure that this becomes another profitable year for guys.
Corn and beans, both you're talking about?
Corn and beans, both.
And what about if the old crop? There's still a lot of that out there in the farms, isn't there?
There is. I'd be getting down onto the last amount of bushels of that. If they've got 25% left or so, that's probably okay.
All in all, hopefully it'll be a good year again.
I hope so.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to analyze cattle markets. The USDA believes farmers across the country will see significantly lower profits this year. The agency is estimating 2015 net farm income at nearly $74 billion, down almost 32% from last year and 43% lower than the record producers set in 2013. Crop receipts in the U.S. are projected to be down about 8% this year. Livestock receipts are estimated to be about 5% lower. We recently talked with Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business Inc. to get an update on costs and returns for Nebraska, starting with a preliminary look at net farm income for her group of Nebraska producers in 2014.
Yeah, it looks like net income is down slightly, but maybe not as down as far as we thought. Certainly had a significant livestock influence in that change. The livestock sector did very well in 2014 and helped balance out some of the downside turn that we saw in the crop industry.
That was the industry that carried it, the livestock.
Sure, yeah, and it's it's been flip-flop for the last few years, so I guess it's their turn to have a little of the enjoyment. So
tell me about costs in 2014.
Yeah, I just looked real briefly at irrigated corn on cash rented ground, and total cost per acre at this point is down slightly, not a lot. Nothing major sticking out. The only thing that I did notice for sure is that cash rent cost per acre was up another $6 an acre. So averaging just over $2.80 an acre.
Is the cost of family living going consistent? Do you see any change there?
If there's any change, it looks like it's going to be slightly higher. Early numbers are looking in that 110 range versus 100 that it's been for the last 2 years. So we'll see when we get final numbers coming in on that.
So getting ready for the 2015 planting season, and even for livestock guys, is there something to keep in mind with budget recommendations, or at least things to think about as you're trying to control costs this year?
So, I think the most important thing is we got to get them down on paper. I'm always surprised with producers who think they have an idea of what their costs are, and when we get them all put together, that they're surprised. And so I don't want anybody to be surprised by losses in this year. And so sitting down and planning out your money and where it's going to go really makes a big difference in how much of it you have at the end.
With the group of producers that you work with, describe the ratio of assets to liabilities.
Yeah, sure. From our current position, our current ratio, or the current assets divided by current debt, is down slightly. We don't want to see that. It's a really.
Why is that troublesome?
Well, it tells us how many times that you can use your current assets, the stuff that you plan to liquidate this year, to pay off the principal and the debt that you have that you need to pay in the next year. So the lower that number gets, the harder it's going to be to meet those annual obligations. And at the same time, total debt to asset and how those two relate to each other is going up, and we don't want to see debt creeping up on our assets. Still not in a bad position. We're looking about maybe 30%, but higher than what we've been at. And so it's an indicator that things are maybe not going in the right direction. From a current standpoint, one of the things we can do, and that I'm hearing a lot of lenders talking about doing, is refinancing that current debt into that long term. It's not going to change our total debt to asset, but it will make it a little easier to meet those financial obligations this year. And it's refinancing isn't a bad thing. I always say it's like a Band-Aid, and if it's a small scratch, and the Band-Aid's going to work to cure it, but if it's a gaping wound in the operation, it's just going to keep causing problems. So we need to make sure that we're fixing the problem that's causing that need.
So right now you would say that you're only slightly concerned about the way they're leveraged. Is that accurate?
Well, and from an average standpoint, sure. I think there's a wide range of producers out there, and there are certainly producers who are in a bigger problem spot than others, especially those who maybe had gotten a little bit complacent with their lenders as far as letting their operating note carry some land purchases or some equipment purchases. Those kinds of things getting pulled and put in their proper position is not a bad thing, and it might just be something that needs to be done at this time.
As you talk to those lenders, Tina, are you hearing more about whether or not they're more willing or less willing to lend to people?
We're starting to hear that the lenders are getting a little nervous, and I understand that it's just a huge change, especially for those who just joined the industry in the last 5 to 6 years that haven't experienced really what comes with projected negative returns and those kinds of things. I think those are especially nervous. And so we just need to be aware of that. Agriculture is still a cyclical business, that we're going to have highs and lows. And that, but we need to be in a good position to make sure that we're not just, creating bigger problems, but problems that we can work with.
The USDA's next scheduled release on U.S. farm incomes is in late August. UNL's Department of Agricultural Economics recently said it expects Nebraska net farm income this year to be about $3.5 billion, down nearly 45% from 2014 and the lowest since 2010. It estimates total expenses in 2015 will be up less than 0.5%, but it also forecasts government payments to be 53% lower. The April Nebraska Farmer says as land prices continue to rise in Nebraska, more producers are looking at ways to get the most out of their crop ground. Growers in the eastern part of the state and those who farm around creeks, watersheds, and wetland soils are trying to increase days suitable for field work through subsurface draining. By doing so, they also hope to raise yields. However, the magazine says there are some things those producers need to consider before getting started, including conservation compliance, finding the right contractor, and the economics. You can read more about it in the April issue of Nebraska Farmer. A 2013 report from UNL's Department of Agricultural Economics told how Nebraska's ag sector, through property taxes, had become the heavy lifter of local government services. From 2012 to 2013, ag land accounted for 87% of the state's total land valuation increase. Nebraska's ag land is currently taxed at 75% of its assessed value, but Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben says there are several bills in the Nebraska Legislature that include property tax reform, including alternatives regarding agriculture. We recently talked with Brad and asked how much of an emphasis state legislators were putting on reform this session.
Well, it's interesting. Tax reform in general, property tax relief in particular, has been an issue ever since the campaign. And then the newly elected governor in his State of the State address highlighted property taxes high on the agenda. And we expected the legislature to certainly pick it up and move something forward. At this point, we're still uncertain as to what that vehicle for relief might be.
Describe the concepts that are out there relating to ag land.
Yeah. One of the concepts, one of the first proposals to surface was to reduce the assessed valuation of farmland. Currently 75%, a proposal to reduce it to 65% of projected or estimated market value. That would reduce the assessed valuation, certainly, but that doesn't necessarily translate into an equal percentage reduction in the tax bill. That's more a function of how dependent is your taxing district on ag land. If it's entirely ag land, for example, changing the assessment doesn't do much to the final bill. It's what the taxing bodies spend that really impacts the final bill. So that bill itself to reduce the assessed valuation died in committee. Whether the idea still has some legs in a final compromise remains to be seen.
There's another idea of toying with the property tax credit, right? Now,
Correct.
How would that work?
Correct. As it currently works, there's, I believe, $160 million a year committed to property tax credits. Essentially, the taxing bodies face the assessed valuations, their levies, they establish a tax bill, and this is just a credit off the top of that bill. So it doesn't change the local revenues to the taxing jurisdictions, it just increases or provides relief to the taxpayer. The proposal in the budget right now would say raise that from $160 million a year to $200 million a year. So some relief certainly. Compare that to the $2 billion plus in actual property taxes collected, it's still a small percentage reduction, but it does provide some relief.
So tell me about the concept that would increase state aid to these schools and maybe by that way reduce the burden from agriculture.
Well, there are two other bigger concepts in terms of how you might provide property tax relief by readjusting more over the entire formula for local jurisdictions. One of those issues is the state aid to schools. State aid of almost $1 billion a year to local school districts certainly does provide some relief against local property tax levies and property tax increases. But certainly increasing state aid to schools doesn't necessarily translate into a dollar for dollar reduction in property taxes. That's a function of what schools are spending. And state aid to schools, state aid to local governments, it's still a function of what gets spent locally, balancing that sort of demand for services against the challenge or the burden on property tax base.
What you're saying is it's not a zero-sum game. Just because you increase the state aid doesn't mean they'll decrease spending by that amount.
There's no clause that says total revenues must remain constant. It's simply an increase in state aid. We would certainly expect that to help relieve property tax pressure, but for districts that might be at a limit but see the need for increased spending, state aid increases that opportunity. It doesn't necessarily decrease the tax levy.
The final that we'll talk about that you hinted at is reforming the way that the mechanism is determined that money goes to schools. How complicated is that?
Well, along with the idea of how do you reallocate state dollars, sales tax and income tax dollars to state aid for schools and local districts, is a big debate about that whole formula. The current formula allocates dollars to districts based in part on enrollment, based on need, and the challenge of reforming that formula seems to be that almost all districts, both rural and urban, are complaining about how the current formula works, both arguing that they need more funds out of that formula. It's hard to imagine reforming that formula without substantially finding new revenues from the state level. So part of the debate is not just about how does the formula work. Part of the debate is how do local services, like schools in particular, that are typically the largest single part of that local property tax bill, how do you fund schools? Should the dependence be on property taxes that might reflect local demands, might reflect local resources, but don't necessarily move in the same direction that enrollment numbers move? So what's the best formula to actually fund those local jurisdictions, particularly schools? That's a bigger issue. We've not yet really addressed that, and certainly I don't expect in the final weeks of the legislature that that's high on the list, but in a longer run perspective, managing local services, demand for services, expectations for local services, and that formula for how to fund them is a big question.
Brad says the legislature is scheduled to meet through the first week of June, and a final budget and tax legislation figured to be one of its final acts. We told you in October about a research project funded by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board targeted at learning more about the use of cover crops in this state. That work was being conducted at 4 UNL locations across Nebraska, but there are also several producers in the state looking to study cover crops through trials in the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network. As Nebraska Extension educator Rees said when we recently talked with her on campus, using cover crops may not always be about increasing yields, but about improving specific aspects of a producer's operation.
There's a lot of different reasons why farmers are interested in cover crops, and what I would suggest first is it's based on what their goal is for cover crops. So some farmers are interested in grazing, some are interested in increasing nitrogen in their fields, so they'd plant a legume. Some are interested in taking up nitrogen, so such as after seed corn. Some are interested in having some natural tillage with some of the different cover crops. So there's a lot of different reasons for cover crops.
Tell me about some of the research that you're doing with farmers in the state to look at cover crops and the potential benefits.
Okay, so last year in 2014, we had farmers in 5 different locations of the state: Phelps County, Franklin, Clay, Seward, and Saunders County, and they were all doing cover crops for the first time. And they were looking at if cover crop, what they did is they had a study where they were looking at the cover crop versus the previous year's residue. And then all of the cover crops were winter killed in these situations. And then they were looking at what the yield of the successive crop was. And if that yield was different where the cover crop was planted versus where they just had the residue.
What did they find in those situations?
Okay, so in these situations, all these farmers were in no-till, and they were all in their first year of planting those cover crops. And in all those situations, they also found that the cover crop didn't yield as much. Where the cover crop was planted, that successive crop, whether it was corn or wheat, didn't yield as much as what the place where the
previous year? Mm-hmm. And why is that, do you think?
Why that is? Well, it could be a number of reasons. It could be rainfall. We had a huge rainfall distribution, even though last year we look at 2014 as being a pretty wet year. It could have also been impacts from the previous years when the cover crop was planted. There could have been less rainfall in some of those locations of the state. There's also research out there that suggests the first year that cover crops are planted doesn't necessarily produce a yield increase in the second year crop. So it's important to go back to why these producers were planting these different cover crops. Some of them were just an individual species, some were a mix. Some of them were doing this for a grazing impact. Some of them were doing it just to look, maybe down the road, look at organic matter increases, and they would measure that with their soil tests.
How many of those farmers are going to continue this study?
We're hoping that all of them will continue the study. From our on-farm research updates last year, it sounds like most of them were willing to try it a second year and just see if there would be what the results were.
So we've talked about on-farm research and specifically the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network before on Market Journal. But for a project like this, how time intensive is it if a producer wanted to do something like this on his or her operation?
Well, when it comes to cover crops, you need to be planning a good year out in some cases, or at least be thinking about it now if you're thinking about planting cover crops. What may be better options for establishment would be after, if you had wheat and you harvest wheat, you could go in with a cover crop mix then and have some good establishment, or if you have to take silage off. Those are some good situations for cover crops this coming year, where you could then go in with another crop next year and look at those differences.
More information about the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network can be found on the Crop Watch website. We'll also link to those materials on the Market Journal homepage. The network is sponsored by Nebraska Extension, the Nebraska Corn Growers Association, the Nebraska Corn Board, and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Now, filling in for the vacationing Al Dutcher, here's Stoney Cooper from the High Plains Regional Climate Center with a weather outlook.
We're still having trouble getting our soil temps above March normals. With the upcoming forecast, it is cautioned against getting into too big a hurry to plant. Rain has not been much of a problem, however, with a few locations seeing over 2 inches for the week. We start out our Saturday forecast with clouds and rain over much of Nebraska with temps in the 40s and low 50s. And we don't warm up much either. Scottsbluff and Rulo bookend the state with the only potential to see 70s, and the majority of the state will stay in the 60s. Although high amounts of potential precipitation are modeled for some parts of western Nebraska, the highest confidence that precipitation will fall is in the southeast. On Sunday, some colder air will keep the temps in the 30s across north-central regions of the state, and no one's going to get very warm. There is model disagreement on the far western edge of Nebraska. I think most around Sidney and Kimball will be lucky to get much above the mid-50s. That is because of rain. Chances are fairly decent that you'll see rain in the same area, with chances down around Imperial and Trenton also. On Monday, it is even cooler, with frost possible around Harrison and Shadron. Southeast Nebraska will be the warm spot, but only in the low 40s. The highs will be a degree or two warmer than Sunday, with upper 60s in the eastern half of the state. We do maintain a chance of rain over the Sandhills, but the highest confidence in rain is the very western extent of the Panhandle. There will be frost again along the Wyoming-Nebraska border and only low 40s across eastern Nebraska. The highs for Tuesday also are not much to brag about. In fact, although warmer in the west, it'll be cooler in the east. Rain chances decrease and spread east, but not so fast. Widespread frost is likely across the Panhandle on Wednesday. The eastern half of the state is not much better, looking at the low 40s. A few degrees warmer for the highs across the state are hopeful. And chances of precipitation continues, particularly across the south central Nebraska. Thursday is another repeat of colder than expected mornings of late April, but sunshine. We finally get to 70 statewide and hopefully warm the soils. With no mention of precipitation, we're finally possibly on the roll. Friday brings us morning temps closer to normal. It starts out in the 50s for all but a few locations. And warm it but does. We're talking about low 80s, spread throughout the southern half of Nebraska, and even 90s are hinted at in Kansas. No major precipitation is on tap for Friday. Our soil temperatures are finally looking better, with low 60s forecasted at 4 inches for west and upper 50s in the east. Finally, in the 8 to 14-day outlook, we see above normal temperatures for the western 4/5 of Nebraska, but with the warmth comes a decreased opportunity for moisture.
Thanks, Stoney. Today's interviews can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, 2014 farm incomes, ag property tax reform, and cover crop research in Nebraska. As always, you can follow Market Journal during the week on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Mike Briggs will look at cattle markets and will show you why Japan is a critical market for U.S. agriculture. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.